Picture this. An aircraft is already in the air. It has been there for hours. Nothing dramatic happens. No alarms, no launch, no impact. The camera feed keeps coming in. The same stretch of ground, the same roads, the same buildings. Time keeps moving. From the outside, it looks like nothing is happening. And that's exactly the problem. Because when people think about the MQ-9, this is not the picture that comes to mind. The image most people carry is much simpler. An unmanned aircraft, a missile, a strike. If nothing is fired, it feels natural to assume the system isn't doing much. No action, no result, no value. That assumption feels intuitive, and for a long time it felt reasonable. This video is not here to tell you that intuition was stupid. It wasn't. It's here to show why that intuition was formed in the first place and why it starts to break once time becomes part of the picture. The MQ-9 entered public awareness through moments, not duration. A strike clip, a grainy infrared feed, a flash, a target disappears. Those moments were easy to understand. They fit neatly into a familiar logic. Action, outcome, value. If a weapon is fired, something clearly happened. If nothing is fired, it feels like nothing happened at all. That framing wasn't invented by mistake. It emerged naturally from how the system was first seen. Early coverage didn't show 8 hours of orbiting. It didn't show empty skies. It didn't show waiting. Because waiting doesn't compress well. It doesn't headline well. It doesn't look like power. So, the public story of the MQ-9 became anchored to its most visible outputs. Missiles became the mental shortcut. Strikes became the proof of relevance. From that perspective, the conclusion made sense. If the MQ-9 isn't striking, it's not really working. That belief didn't come from ignorance. It came from incomplete exposure. Imagine encountering the MQ-9 without context. You see footage of weapons being released, you hear about targets being hit, you're told it's unmanned, persistent, precise. What would you focus on? Not the hours before the strike, not the hours after. You'd focus on the moment where something clearly changed, because that's how most military systems are introduced. Jets are remembered for dogfights, bombers are remembered for payloads, missiles are remembered for impact. The MQ-9 entered the same mental category. It looked like a platform whose value was expressed through action, so people judged it accordingly. No strike, then nothing important happened. That logic didn't need to be taught, it formed automatically. What rarely made it into that mental picture was time. Not flight time as a statistic, not endurance as a specification, but time as a lived condition. Hours of presence, hours of continuity, hours where nothing changes until suddenly it does. The old intuition compresses all of that into a single question. Did it fire? If the answer is no, the system disappears from relevance. But that compression hides something important. Because in reality, the MQ-9 is most active when nothing visible happens. Most of the time, the MQ-9 is not striking. It is already airborne. Already connected, already watching. It is not waiting for permission to launch, it is waiting for reality to change. That difference matters, because the system is not dispatched in response to certainty, it's positioned in response to uncertainty. Targets don't announce themselves on schedule, windows don't stay open, moments don't wait for assets to arrive. So the value of the MQ-9 emerges before action is required. Not when something happens, but so something doesn't get missed. From the outside, that looks like inactivity. From inside the system, it's constant readiness. Here's where the tension starts. The old intuition measures value by visible action. The MQ-9's real work happens before action exists. So when people ask, what did it do today? They're already using the wrong unit of measurement. Most days, the honest answer is, it stayed, it watched, it was available. And for an intuition trained on impact, that answer feels empty. Nothing exploded, nothing ended, nothing changed, but the system kept running. Human intuition struggles with waiting. We associate effort with movement, effect with change, importance with visible consequence. Waiting looks passive, waiting looks easy, waiting looks replaceable, but that's only true if waiting is cheap, and in this case it isn't. The MQ-9 doesn't wait on the ground, it waits in the air. It waits while maintaining connection, it waits while holding position, it waits while staying usable. That waiting consumes time, attention and coordination, even if nothing fires. Yet none of that shows up in the old mental model. Once you notice this mismatch, a strange question appears. If the MQ-9 only counts when it strikes, what exactly is it doing the rest of the time? That question doesn't invalidate the old intuition, it simply exposes its limits. The old logic was built for systems whose value peaks at action, but the MQ-9 spends most of its life away from that peak. And when a system's primary state is not action, judging it by action alone becomes unstable. At this point, it would be tempting to explain why the MQ-9 was built this way. It would be easy to talk about design choices, or trade-offs, or why this approach makes sense. That would be a mistake, because the goal here isn't to replace one explanation with another. It's to notice that the original explanation is no longer enough. All we've done so far is this. We followed the old intuition to the edge of reality and found that it doesn't quite hold. Nothing has been concluded, nothing has been named. We've only widened the frame, so we pause here with a system that appears idle yet never really is, with an intuition that once worked but now struggles to explain what we're actually seeing. If the MQ-9 isn't defined by the moments it fires, what exactly are we missing when we only look for those moments? That question is where the entrance layer ends. To see where the old intuition breaks, you don't need new concepts, you only need to stretch the timeline. Instead of asking what the MQ-9 did at a specific moment, ask a different question. Where was it before anything happened? In most stories about air power, the sequence is clear. A target appears, an aircraft is tasked, a mission begins, action comes first, presence follows. But with the MQ-9, the order is reversed. Presence comes first, action may never arrive. The aircraft is already airborne before certainty exists, before a target is confirmed, before anyone knows whether anything will happen at all. From the outside, that looks inefficient. Why keep something flying when nothing is happening? The old intuition doesn't have a good answer for that, because it assumes relevance begins at action. Most of the MQ-9's life exists in a long middle, not the beginning, not the end. The middle is quiet, it's a steady orbit, a continuous feed, a system that doesn't demand attention but never stops providing it. There are no clear markers in this phase, no moment you can point to and say, that's when the mission mattered. And because there's no marker, the old intuition collapses the middle into nothing. If nothing happens, nothing is remembered. Once you stop collapsing the timeline, the picture shifts. The MQ-9 isn't waiting for permission to act, it's absorbing uncertainty. It exists in the gap between something might happen and now it has. That gap can last minutes, it can last hours, it can last days. And during that entire span, the system remains active, not dramatic, not decisive, just present. This is where the old logic begins to strain, because action is no longer the start of relevance, it's just one possible outcome. In this stretched view, firing a weapon becomes rare, not because the system can't strike, but because striking is not what defines its usefulness. Most of the time, nothing reaches the threshold where action is required, but that doesn't mean the system was idle. It means the system was already positioned so that action wouldn't be delayed if the threshold were crossed. From the old intuition's perspective, that looks like wasted effort. From the timeline's perspective, that effort is the point. Here's the quiet inversion. With the MQ-9, the cost is paid up front, and the payoff may never come. You spend hours in the air for the possibility of a moment. And if that moment never arrives, the system still did what it was meant to do. That idea is deeply uncomfortable for an intuition trained on outcomes because it suggests something unsettling. A system can succeed without producing a visible event. We're used to systems proving themselves through change. A bridge proves itself when cars cross it. A generator proves itself when power flows. A weapon proves itself when it fires. But the MQ-9 spends most of its time proving nothing, it just remains. That doesn't feel like work, it doesn't feel like effort, it doesn't feel like value. Until you remove it. Once you see the full timeline, a different question emerges. Not, why didn't it strike? But, what would have happened if it hadn't already been there? That question is uncomfortable because it points to an absence, and absences don't show up in footage, they don't generate headlines, they don't feel real, but they shape outcomes anyway. At this point, the original belief starts to wobble. If a system is only considered active when it fires, then most of what the MQ-9 does disappears from relevance. But if most of what it does disappears, the system itself becomes hard to explain, not wrong, just incomplete. The old intuition doesn't collapse, it simply stops being sufficient. We stop here, not with an answer, but with a mismatch. A system whose most common state is presence, an intuition that only recognizes action. They don't align anymore, and until that gap is acknowledged, any explanation built on the old logic will feel slightly off. That's enough for now. At some point, the question shifts again. Not, what did it strike? But how long has it already been there? Once you ask that, the MQ-9 stops looking like a system waiting to act and starts looking like a system designed to endure. In the old intuition, presence is just downtime. The quiet space between meaningful moments, the empty stretch before something finally happens. Before the MQ-9, presence is not a pause. It is the primary condition. The aircraft is launched without knowing whether the day will contain a strike at all. It stays airborne through uncertainty, through false leads, through moments that never materialize. And when nothing happens, the system doesn't reset. It continues. Most systems are evaluated by what they produce. Did they deliver? Did they change something? Did they finish the job? The MQ-9 complicates that logic because its value is front-loaded. By the time an outcome exists, the important work has already been done. The aircraft didn't rush to the moment, it absorbed time so the moment wouldn't be missed. From the outside, that can look invisible. From the inside of the system, that invisibility is the feature. Here's where the discomfort peaks. Many MQ-9 sorties end without action. No launch, no explosion, no confirmation slide. And yet, those sorties are not considered failures. They are logged, they are planned, they are repeated. That should feel strange, because under the old intuition, a mission without action should feel empty. But in practice, it doesn't. Something else is being measured, just not something that fits into the old frame. The original belief assumes, if nothing happened, nothing was accomplished. But the MQ-9 operates in environments where waiting is the only way to avoid being late, where presence must exist before importance can be confirmed. In those conditions, action becomes a secondary concern. Not irrelevant, just not central. And that creates a problem for the old intuition, because it has no way to value a system that succeeds by staying usable. At this point, the contradiction is clear. A platform that spends most of its life present, judged by moments when it acts. A system whose success is measured by readiness, not results. Those two ideas don't cancel each other out. They just don't sit comfortably together. And resolving that discomfort requires a different way of thinking about power. Not more facts, not better footage, not deeper technical detail. Just a willingness to accept that some systems work by not being used. So we stop here. with an aircraft that looks idle but never really is, with an intuition that wants action but keeps running into time, and with a quiet realization, if you only count the moments when something happens, you miss the systems that exist, so those moments don't arrive too late. That realization is enough. No explanation yet, no naming yet, no conclusion, just a frame that no longer fits as cleanly as it used to,